The Irish model, both the Human Rights Commission and the Equality Authority, combines both functions, to enforce the law and also to be activist and campaigning. Now that's important, because sometimes, as in recent one or two judgments, in particular the judgment by Mr. Justice Hardiman in the Portmarnock Supreme Court decision, you will see a fairly implicit, perhaps even explicit, questioning of what the Equality Authority and other bodies are doing, taking, if you want, activist cases, attempting to push the boat out. It's built into the function of equality and human rights bodies to enforce existing law, but also to push the boat out. That is precisely the role they're supposed to be filling. That is precisely the job which they are established to try and do, to contest issues, to problematize existing structures, to ask questions, to challenge. So it's important to think about this tension between enforcement and activism. It's also important to think about issues of independence. Now, you know, many people in this room will have very different opinions on the independence issue. I must say, looking at it externally, and this is just reflected on some comments that have been said to me, there are concerns when a country in good international standing like Ireland carries out sweeping budget cuts to its equality and human rights institutions, okay? Because there are issues of precedent. Because bear in mind that, you know, in our common European space, what countries with perceived good records do something, then it means that countries who are perceived to have not so good records have a precedent, okay? My favorite example, by the way, in case you haven't seen it, is that Pakistan has recently cited our new blasphemy law here in Ireland in the UN General Assembly as an example of best practice. That's just a recent example. I don't know if you've seen that. But it's important because Ireland has a history of leadership in international institutions in the UN and the Council of Europe in equality and human rights matters. A very proud history of leadership. But then you have facts on the ground and you have government ministers in other countries saying, well, is there a tension here between the rhetoric and the delivery? It is important, however, to say that independence is always a tricky issue for national human rights institutions. They are publicly funded bodies. The taxpayer is entitled to ask for an account. The taxpayer and the people who pay for national human rights institutions are entitled to ask for some sort of regulation of how money is spent. And it's very important that civil society organizations don't fall into the trap of thinking that equality and human rights institutions will always mirror or reflect their views. Civil society does one thing, equality and human rights institutions do another thing. I'm always concerned in the UK, for example, about the extent to which the views of the head and leading figures in the Equality and Human Rights Commission are often cited as representing the views of black minority ethnic communities. I mean, Karen will know more about this than I will, but it's certainly an enormous problem when the head of a taxpayer-funded institution, the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK, appointed by the government, is called upon to speak for black and minority ethnic people in the UK. Now, that's a conflict of roles. And equality, human rights institutions do one job, civil society do another job. And there'll sometimes be tensions there. And that's important. And that gap must be maintained. However, and this is an absolutely central point, the job of national human rights institutions is to be challenging. Their job is to be difficult, to be controversial, to annoy media columnists in the Irish Independent and other institutions. Their job is to get under the skin, because there are lots of other institutions and bodies who can perform the job of helping society run smoothly on existing lines. Taxpayers will get value for money when they establish institutions that rub up against the status quo, that force us into a process of critical self-reflection. That's what value for money means in the context of equality and human rights institutions. Some wider European perspectives. All of this is in the report, okay, that's going to be launched in the next session. I'll just flag it up there. You can read it. So too are the Berlin conclusions of the International Council on Human Rights in 2005. Okay. All of this, but all these reports taken together, show certain trends in thinking about independence. There is a European-wide emphasis in the academic research on the need to rethink accountability relationships, to have an open discussion about how equality and human rights institutions should be accountable for the work they do, for the taxpayer funds that they spend. In country after country, you've had research emphasizing how valuable it would be to have direct accountability to Parliament. Now, wearing my hat as a constitutional law academic, it is fascinating, both here in the UK, how underdeveloped parliamentary forms of accountability are. Okay? And there are extremely strong arguments for reshaping accountability networks so that equality and human rights institutions become accountable straight to the elected Parliament. But that's something we can perhaps discuss. There are also serious issues, serious debates to be had about equality and human rights commissions, how they should spend their money. A lot of the literature across Europe, academic literature, talks about self-monitoring, assessing stakeholder satisfaction, training and education in the field of human rights, mapping and auditing work in the human rights situation, and so on. Just to be controversial, I'm going to sound a note of caution about this. I'm often concerned that training and education, engaging in structured dialogue, and so on, tends to sort of be built around the impression that there's a seamless web of human rights and equality standards that everyone can agree with. We can all sit down. It's just a matter of educating people. You educate people in primary school, you educate the minister, and all will be well. You know, it's the idea that if you trap the minister in a room, whatever minister it is, in a room for 3 hours with a copy of the relevant UN conventions, you'll change everything. That's not the way the world works. Issues about equality and human rights are contested, ferociously fought out, subject of controversy. And this is exactly, I keep on emphasizing this point, where equality and human rights commissions come in. Okay? Their job is to be the grit in the oyster. Their job is to provoke reflection, to provoke self-examination. If they do that, then that's where taxpayers' money is getting its value from.